Okay, so this is Bible study for Genesis chapter 30, verses 25 through 43. And decided there's enough meat in this to go ahead and stop there, even though I feel like the story continues into 31. So we'll focus on this for today. Um, the text says, after Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me on my way so I can go back to my homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you. But Laban said to him, if I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. He added, name your wages and I will pay them. Jacob said to him, you know how I have worked for you, and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household? What shall I give you? He asked. Don't give me anything, Jacob replied, but if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go throughout all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark colored lamb, every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages. And my honesty will testify for me in the future. Whenever you check on the wages you have paid me, any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark colored, will be considered stolen. Agreed, said Laban. Let it be as you have said. That same day he removed all the male goats from the streaked or spotted, and that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. Jacob, however, took fresh cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees, and made white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they made it in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals, so they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban, and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks, and female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. All right. So remember that you can download PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive so that you can follow along with us. And number one says, what did we learn in last week's Bible study? And we were in the beginning of chapter 30, and we basically learned about Jacob's children, at least 11 of the 12 down to Joseph. We learned about the tension between Jacob's wives, the sisters, um, and how they sort of competed for Jacob's affection and for the blessing that they considered having children. So that was basically the story of last time. Number two, what is happening now in 30, 25, and 26? Jacob said to Laban, send me on my way, which honestly, I'm just going to say, I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. And I have trouble saying those words without saying, send me on my way. And if you don't know then that's fine. B. Jacob was ready to go back to his homeland, which was important also to Abraham and Isaac because of God's promise. So remember that he says, you know, it's time for me to go back. Send me on my way. And I've done everything that you've asked. I've done all the work that was necessary to earn the wives that I said that I would work for. Maybe we could say he had done more than was ever asked of him because Laban did not follow through with the original promise, and he ended up working 14 years instead of 7 years. Um, so he's ready to move on. See, Jacob said, give me my wives and children for whom I have served you. You know how much work I have done for you. So at this point, Jacob's intention was never to stay with Laban. He only stayed there to work for Rachel. And then when he was given Leah instead of Rachel, he stayed another 7 years to work for Rachel um, after he had both of them, and obviously had all these children. And he's at a place where now he has paid off every last penny, if you will, that he owed, and even more so because Laban had dealt dishonestly with him, and now he's ready to go. Number three says, how did Laban respond? A, please stay if I have found favor in your eyes. So Laban has gotten great work out of Jacob. He's given away his daughters, but he has prospered in response. In fact, B says, I've learned. It says by divination, but the idea is by finding out from God what he says, that the Lord has blessed me because of you. So, in other words, I see the blessing that's happening since you've been working for me. I didn't understand why it was. I talked to God, and God has told me that the reason I'm being blessed is because of you. Please stay. I want to keep being blessed because of you. Then he says, see, name your wages and I'll pay them like I've been trustworthy to pay before, which he doesn't say that, but that's sort of tongue in cheek. As I read this, I thought, why would Jacob listen to Laban when Laban has not dealt honestly with him? But he says, just tell me what I owe you, and I'll pay whatever you ask, so that you continue to work for me because I'm being blessed because of you. So how did Jacob respond according to 30:29 through 30? He said, you know, I've worked for you and how your livestock have fared. So you know that you've been blessed during this. You've gotten everything you deserved and more from me. He said, the little you had before I came has greatly increased, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But when may I do something for my own household? So here's something that's important to understand, that prior to this, Jacob did not have his own flocks. Prior to this, he had earned his wives, and they had given him children, and um, he had been blessed, but he did not have anything that was his own. He would have to return to his family. That was his inheritance, but he didn't bring much with him, and he didn't have anything of his own. So he was just basically, I'm sure that anything Laban had was his at some level, but he's thinking long term, and he's thinking, when do I sort of begin building something for my family? I've got 11 kids, 11 boys, plus at least one girl that we've learned of. And I need something to pass down to them. Right now, I'm just building your flocks. Um, so um, number 4, what did Laban say according to 30:31? What shall I give you? He asked. So he said, I'll give you anything, basically. How did Jacob respond according to 31 through 33? He said, don't give me anything, but if you will do one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks. Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled and spotted sheep, every dark colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages, and my honesty will testify for me in the future. So he's setting it up so that he won't be accused of cheating him, or he's pulling out obviously different animals as his wages, and assuming these animals don't mate with each other. At least this would be sort of the obvious conclusion. Then then they're going to keep producing ones that look like them. That's the idea. So, and that's a reasonable thought. That we reproduce, we as humans and animals reproduce things that tend to look like us. Now, that being said, I'm not sure they had a full idea of genetics in that day, but there are recessive genes we know now, which means there are certain things that show up, that two parents could have a recessive gene that doesn't show up in them that does show up in their children. And I'm not sure they understood that. Laban obviously didn't understand that. So Jacob says, I'm going to separate out all the speckled and spotted animals. You're going to keep all the animals that look one way. And as long as they're separated and not intermingling, then at least in theory, they will produce what looks like them, and we'll be able to tell really clearly which ones are yours and which ones are mine, and you'll be able to check if I've ever cheated you. Um, so that's the plan. That's how Jacob responds. Now, in number 5, it says, how did Laban respond according to 34 through 37? Agreed. Obviously he agreed. He wanted Jacob to stay. So the idea is he's probably going to agree to anything. B, Laban was shrewd and perhaps quite dishonest, as we've sort of noted already. Jacob had proposed that he would choose a very small number of the herd because the spotted and streaked was likely a recessive trait that was somewhat rare. This seemed like a great deal to Laban. So he's proposing to remove a select group, which is probably a small group and is probably one that Laban assumes will not produce very many. And perhaps maybe Laban assumes that he'll be able to catch Jacob, because if you know if something produces white sheep, then he's going to catch him, things like that. So then C says, well, he could also catch Jacob if he was being dishonest, because if he only had animals with this recessive trait, then he would never have a plain sheep or goat. They would all be spotted or speckled. So whether they understood recessive traits or not, Jacob's if all of these animals had this recessive trait, then the dominant trait would not be likely to be passed down, and so they would all produce. As long as they mated with each other, they would all produce. And this is kind of important, because what it means is if it's a recessive trait, and I didn't do all the genetics on this, but I did do some study, and I saw a paper actually written with data. It was kind of crazy to talk about this situation. But the way I understand genetics, if two animals with the same recessive trait mate, they're going to pass on that recessive trait. But if one with the recessive trait mates with an animal with the dominant trait, then it's, I think, 75-25 that dominant will be passed down. So if the plain is the dominant, then if a plain and a speckled or spotted mate, then 75% chance that this is going to be dominant. And only, uh, it's only, it's been a while since I did this in biology, but it's only if two recessive, which it's possible that a dominant an animal with a dominant gene passes down the recessive because they have the recessive and it matches with the recessive that this one has. But it's also possible that they have two of the dominant genes, and in that case, they that would always produce the dominant. And if it has one of each, then also 50% of the time that would produce the dominant. Okay. I just like threw everybody down a loop. I don't know. But the point is that it is going to be exceedingly unlikely that the plain sheep produce anything but plain sheep and goats. Um, sheep and goats, sheep and goats. Goats don't produce sheep, just in case you were wondering, and vice versa. But um, it is also exceedingly unlikely that the speckled or spotted would produce plain. And even if they were to intermix, it would be unlikely that these, not impossible, but unlikely that these produce speckled and spotted. So this seems like a good deal to Laban, is the point. It seems like a deal where it should be easy to find out if Jacob was cheating. It should be easy to, and it's probably not going to be a lot that that I'm paying him. So Laban jumps on this deal. So then, number 6, what did Jacob do next? So I think I kind of skipped over this a little bit too. That the first thing that happened here, and it would have been helpful in my study if I'd have focused a little more on this, because I was getting myself a little confused. But so it's once Jacob pulled out the speckled, he put them under the care of his sons. And Laban put a 3 days journey between him and Jacob. And Jacob continued to care for Laban's sheep and goats, his flock. So Jacob's sons, he's got 11 of them, are caring for the speckled and spotted. Jacob is caring for Laban's animals. Um, so, um, so yes, so then what he does here is what he does with Laban's animals. So now, what did Jacob do next according to 30, 37 through 42? Laban was never going to let him leave. He had to find a way to get Laban to want him to leave. God's blessing needed to fall on him and not Laban, for instance, rather than Laban being blessed because of him. Now, I don't know if this was in Jacob's mind, but it is true that Laban is being blessed by God because of Jacob. So Laban does not want him to leave. And the only way Laban is ever going to let him leave is if it's clear that God's blessing is now falling on Jacob and not Laban. And so, and by the way, if God is truly blessing because of Jacob, then that seems like the natural outcome too. And I want to just process. Um, when we talk about God's blessing, we have a tendency to talk about it as if it's like, woo, and like, and like, so in fact, we often emphasize that if we've been blessed by God, we did nothing to earn it. It was His grace. It was His care for us, that blessing. And so I agree with that, and I believe that. But I also believe that God's blessing often comes not because of something intangible that sort of falls on us, but sometimes because of tangible things that we see. So for instance, am I blessed by God because I'm blessed by God not because of my own anything of myself, but because of God. But am I blessed perhaps because of gifts and understanding and insight that God has given me, that is because of Him, but that I act on His gifts, His understanding and insight, and therefore am blessed. So, for instance, is somebody blessed financially because God just showered rain on them and not on somebody else? Or is somebody blessed financially because God gave some very specific instructions about how to be good stewards of what God has given you? And so then we become better stewards of our finances and the things that we have that belong to God ultimately, that He has given us. Um, and we've become better stewards, and therefore what we have is multiplied and His blessing is evident. So I'm saying all this to try to help us understand that sometimes God's blessing falls because God has given us direction, insight, understanding, even gifting that without Him we wouldn't have. But because we put it into practice, we put our gifts and our insight and understanding, our obedient action into practice, then our lives are blessed. And I absolutely believe that. I believe that sometimes God blesses in ways that are supernatural and sort of rain on us. But I believe much of the time God blesses through gifts, commands, instructions that we sort of put into practice, insight, understanding, discernment that we put into practice, and then therefore are blessed. So, all that says that if we choose not to put those things into practice, God may have wanted to bless us, attempted to bless us, but we didn't obey Him and we didn't follow, and therefore we are not blessed. And that's important. So then some of what Jacob does from here on out shows some insight into caring for flocks that perhaps Laban did not have. So, is it God or is it Jacob? It's certainly God. But how why are the Laban's flocks being blessed? Why is everything under Jacob's care being blessed? Why does Egypt succeed? And I'm jumping forward in Genesis. Why does Egypt succeed under Joseph when everybody else struggles? Because he taught the king how to weather the storms by storing up in times of wealth, so that during times of famine they had enough. That is stewardship. That is action. And therefore God provided for all of Israel, Joseph's brothers, through that. Okay. So that's another example. B, some kind of hocus pocus. It seems that surely can't be shown to have really worked. In other words, so a lot of people have read this passage and they read about sort of the striped sticks and they think, did Jacob really think that he could make a striped stick, and then somebody that was mating, an animal that was mating while you looking at a striped stick would produce striped offspring? Because that's what it sounds like it says. And maybe that's what he thought. I don't know. But that that would not have worked unless God somehow made it work. But that wouldn't have worked. However, so whether Jacob understood this or not, um, let's go down to C. Although it seems like the point was to get the animals to look at striped things and then have striped babies, which would never work, um, he really exposed the inner wood of trees that had medicinal uses, including reducing bleeding, increasing digestive health, and increasing reproductive rates, and he put them into the water that the flocks were drinking at certain times. So whether Jacob understood this at the time, and I feel like that he probably did, when he striped those sticks, he was exposing. So the bark is a protective coating both for the tree, but also would cause the things inside the tree that may be herbal remedies or medicinal not to get out into the water. So when he striped those sticks and put them into the water, he was allowing the medicinal effects of the plant, of the tree, to escape into the water. And the study that I read showed that one of these three trees that was listed actually increased reproductive, as even today, sort of in modern times, has been shown to increase reproductive rates among animals by 20%. Um, and another one is deals with clotting and things like that, and another one deals with stomach illness. And so what he was doing is, with certain sheep and goats came to the watering hole, he was putting medicine in their water. And then he was making sure those were the ones that reproduced. And as it turns out, it was the ones that were producing spotted and streaked animals. So then those came to Jacob as his wages, um, even if their parents originally had not been streaked or spotted. So say there's streaked or spotted within, and then there wasn't any, and then all of a sudden there was somehow in Laban's flock. How? Well, it was a recessive gene that some plain sheep and goats ended up having streaked or spotted um, offspring. And then now we know that they have that recessive gene and they reproduce. So now Jacob has a way of getting more streaked and spotted animals even out of the plain animals that were Laban's. And he ensures that those animals reproduce more, and he ensures that those animals reproduce with the healthiest of the animals and are the healthiest. Um, and in that way, he continues um, to be blessed, to prosper. Now the question is he cheating Laban? Well, no, this is what he was told the wages would be, and this is how we were told that that it would be divided out. And by the way, it's also how we were told we could tell that nobody's cheating, because they're going to be separated in this way. And so Jacob, however, understood taking care of flocks much differently and better than Laban, which is why Laban had been blessed so much while he was there to begin with, because of him. It is also D. It is also possible that the stripes attracted the young lambs, which in turn attracted mothers, which made them prime targets for males to initiate reproduction. So it says he separated out the young. It says so. It's possible that they were attracted to something that looked like them and didn't realize it wasn't their mother or things like that. But the young were over here. The mothers turned to their young, and the male animals came up behind the mothers. And I think that's as far as I need to go on that. And so it's possible that even some of it was positioning. And I'm not sure we need to like. So I'm kind of I got kind of nerded out on this. Let me just say that. Um, about how, but I think the bottom line is one, Jacob's not some idiot that just thought that if he put striped things in front of them, they would reproduce striped animals. It seems to me like he was quite wise and understanding in his care for the flocks. He had spent a lot of time caring for the flocks, and in doing so, had learned some things about how they reproduce and about medicine for them. And there's a reason that God has been blessing Laban's flocks under Jacob, and Jacob is using that knowledge now, as he told Laban he wanted to begin building something for himself. And Laban agreed to all of this, that this is how you can build something for yourself, and this is how we'll know we aren't cheating each other. And but what's happening now is Jacob, now that they have a separation, previous in the 14 years before this, there was no separation. Jacob was only caring for Laban's flocks, so therefore Laban's flocks were multiplying. Now Jacob is caring for his own flocks and Laban's flocks separately. He put his own under his sons, and his concern now, as he said, let me go so that I can produce something for my family, for my household. And Laban said, well, I need you to still care for. So now Jacob is divided. He is not totally loyal to multiplying Laban's flocks. In fact, he is intent on multiplying something for his household, as he told Laban, and now he is getting wages, which Laban agreed to because he thought it would be small. But Jacob is making sure that it is much larger wages than Laban thought he was agreeing to. Not than Laban agreed to, but than he thought he was agreeing to. Um, because Laban wanted to pay him very little so that his flocks would be blessed. Jacob did not want to be there at all. And so Jacob is now caring for his flocks, making sure they are blessed, and they are being blessed more than Laban's flocks, which ultimately is going to make Laban upset, and he's going to not want him there anymore, which, by the way, is also what Jacob wanted to begin with. Jacob was also selective as to which members of Laban's flock were reproducing most by who was at the watering hole when the medicine was there. This allowed the strongest and healthiest animals to reproduce more, and hopefully those that had genes that reproduce streaked or spotted animals. So that he was doing that. He was doing that on purpose. Um, and um, and God's blessing was falling on his flocks instead of Laban's. Previously, God had blessed Laban's flocks because of him. And so, honestly, Jacob had earned much more, but he took what was a small part and used his expertise to multiply it. And yeah, so when I was reading this, it's easy to read this text and think, well, Jacob, here's the usurper again. Here's the heel grabber. Here's the one cheating people again. But one of the commentaries I read said Jacob was not cheating Laban. He was doing what they agreed to. Um, but Laban had a consistent pattern of cheating Jacob, and Jacob was using what Laban agreed to make sure that his household was blessed, and no longer allowing that blessing to fall on Laban instead of him when it came from his what God had given him. So, number 7, what was the result according to 30:43? In the same way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. So, Jacob was prosperous. And he grew exceedingly prosperous, it says. Was this his own skill or knowledge, or was God involved in this? So let's go back. God blessed. We heard this. We said this. God, it's God's blessing, but sometimes God's blessing comes through the gifts, skills, and knowledge that He gives to us. And when we put those things into practice, He multiplies them. And we need to still see that as God's blessing and God's work, and never get to the place where we say that was me, because God's the one that gave that to us. But we also need to sort of I think we tend to put these in separate camps and say anything that I do is from me, and anything that God does without me is from Him. But what if the things that I do is from God because He gave me the gifts to be able to do it? He gave me the knowledge. He gave me the breath in my lungs. So when I put His instruction, His discernment, His wisdom into practice, when I obey Him, and it multiplies, is that me earning that, or is that because of God? Well, obviously it's because of God. Um, Although we like to take credit. So what I'm trying to do here is trying to get us to stop separating sort of, and I say this like we think, what comes to mind is we think what God does is voodoo. And I understand that voodoo is another religion, and voodoo is not of God, and it's evil, and all of that. But what I mean by that is in voodoo, you poke something and somebody else feels pain, and there seems to be literally no connection between these two things, and it has to be sort of all spiritual. And so, what I mean when I say that it's voodoo is we think everything that God does is sort of this supernatural thing that has no connection with any real action. And then we think everything else is what we actually do, and we like to separate these things. But I want to say that what God does is He gifts us, He empowers us, He gives us discernment and understanding, He commands us. And if we follow Him, it multiplies. And so the things that we have produced came from Him, and therefore can be seen as His blessing. And so in that way, I would say this was Jacob's skill and knowledge, and God was involved in it. It didn't come from Jacob, it came from God. And that's why I'm sort of trying to pull these two things together instead of separating them, and saying that everything that I do, I should be attributing to God, because it's not me to begin with, because I couldn't do it without Him. And sort of correcting that dichotomy is important to me, so that we see that God is blessing Jacob, but some of God's blessing is through the understanding and knowledge that He's given him about how to tend flocks and reproductive rates and things like that, that should have been way beyond, I think, their sort of technology to understand.